She stopped in front of the display window. She didn't walk in right away. She just stood there, hands resting on her 8 months pregnant belly, staring at those tiny clothes hanging behind the glass like they belonged to another world, a world she didn't belong to anymore. She took a breath and walked in. She had no money. She had nothing. But she had that need, the one only a mother understands, to at least get a closer look at something she'd never be able to buy. A woman walked up almost immediately. Her eyes dropped just for a second to the worn coat, the scuffed shoes, and in that second, she'd already decided who Claire was. "This store isn't a charity," the woman said, not bothering to lower her voice. "If you can't afford to be here, I'm going to have to ask you to leave before I call security." But neither of them knew that across the store, a man had just heard every word, and he was about to change both their lives, one way and the other. Her name was Claire Bennett, 29 years old, 8 months pregnant. Until recently, she'd worked as an office assistant at a small accounting firm in Chicago. Nothing fancy, but it was hers. It was stable until they let her go. Downsizing, they told her. But she knew the truth. It's a lot easier to cut a pregnant woman than to keep her on while her belly grows, and her output, as they'd put it, slows down. Nobody said it in those words. Nobody ever does. But she felt it. And the baby's father, Ryan, had walked out 2 weeks after she told him. No fight, no real goodbye. Just a text. "I'm not ready for this. I'm sorry." Like a life could be settled with 4 words and a sorry. Since then, Claire had been living alone in a rented room, counting every dollar, wondering how she was going to bring a baby home without so much as a crib. That afternoon, walking back from yet another interview that had gone nowhere, another company that unfortunately couldn't accommodate her situation, she'd ended up outside a boutique, Ivory Lane, the most upscale baby store in the neighborhood, spotless window displays, hand-stitched onesies, the kind of place she never would have set foot in any other day of her life. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the pale blue romper folded on a velvet cushion. Maybe it was just months of denying herself everything, finally catching up to her. And that's how she'd ended up inside, the air smelling like lavender and fresh cotton, listening to the store manager, a tall woman with sleek platinum hair and a gold name tag that read Victoria Sinclair, make it very clear she wasn't welcome. Claire lowered her head, felt the tears gathering behind her eyes, the ones she'd learned, these past few months, to swallow in public. "You're right," she murmured. "I was just leaving." She turned to go. She felt in that moment the full weight of the last few months, the layoff, the breakup, the nights wondering if she'd make rent, and now this. One more humiliation, in a place where she hadn't even planned to buy anything. She thought about her son. He wasn't even born yet, and the world was already showing him how hard it would be. Then a voice, steady, not raised, cut through the store. "Victoria." Everyone froze. A man had stepped out from the back office, tall in a grey suit with no tie, sandy blonde hair slightly tousled, like he'd spent the morning buried in paperwork instead of dressing to impress. James Callahan, 38, owner of Ivory Lane and 4 other stores across the country. Nobody had seen him come in that afternoon. He'd used the back entrance, the way he usually did when he wanted to check on his staff without any fanfare, and he'd heard everything. Victoria went pale. "Mr. Callahan, I know exactly what you were doing," he said, his voice quiet, but with an edge that left no room for doubt. He walked toward Claire, who hadn't moved, still gripping the strap of her bag, not sure what was happening. Then, to everyone's surprise, including her own, James smiled, warm, genuine. "So glad you made it," he said, like they'd known each other for years. "Take your time. Pick out whatever you need. Victoria's going to take great care of you." Claire blinked. I'm sorry, I think there's some kind of mistake. He didn't give her room to finish. "Victoria," he said, eyes still on Claire, "pull the new collection that came in this week." "Boy or girl?" Claire's face went hot. "Boy," she managed, barely above a whisper. "Perfect. Everything for a boy. Newborn onesies, blankets, the diaper bag, the whole set." Victoria swallowed hard, anger climbing up her chest like fire. But she didn't say a word. "Yes, sir," she said, and turned toward the back of the store. Claire wanted to speak, wanted to stop all of this, explain there was no way she could pay for any of it. But James had already walked off, browsing a display table like this was the most normal thing in the world. For the next half hour, Claire moved through the store in a daze. Victoria, jaw tight, smile forced, pulled item after item. And every time Claire lingered a little too long on something, her hand brushing the soft fabric of an embroidered blanket, James, a few steps back, would give a small nod. "That one too?" At first, Claire protested. "No, really, you don't have to, I was just looking." But he'd just smile and change the subject, asking if she'd picked a name yet, or when she was due, until she gave up arguing, overwhelmed, unsure what else to say. By the time they were done, the counter looked like a small mountain. Onesies, swaddle blankets, hooded bath towels, a navy diaper bag, even a crib mobile. Claire stared at all of it, somewhere between awe and shame. "Sir," she said finally, her voice breaking, "I really appreciate this, but I have no way to pay for any of it. I'm unemployed. I swear I was only looking." James studied her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Barely there, but real. "Don't worry about that," he said. "Victoria, wrap it all up, please." Victoria pressed her lips together and obeyed silently, packing each piece with a slowness that gave away exactly how angry she was. When the bags were ready, James picked them both up himself, not letting Claire carry a single one. Before heading out, he stopped in front of Victoria, looked at her directly, voice calm but heavy with meaning. "Victoria, we don't look down on people here. I don't care how someone's dressed or what's in their wallet. I don't want to see this again, understood?" "Yes, sir," she said, barely audible, not daring to look up. "Come on," he said to Claire, "I'll drive you home." "That's really not necessary. I can just take a—" "I insist." And there was something in his tone, not bossy, just certain, like a man used to things being done a certain way, but without cruelty, that made Claire, for the first time in a long while, stop arguing. In the car, the silence felt awkward at first. James broke it. "When's the baby due?" "About a month. I'm 32 weeks. "And the father?" Claire looked out the window. "Not in the picture," she said flat. "He left as soon as I told him. We haven't spoken since." James didn't say anything right away, kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "You don't have to be. You had nothing to do with it. Still, I'm sorry it happened to you." Claire stayed quiet a moment, then, without really knowing why, started talking. About the layoff, the interviews that went nowhere, the nights wondering how she'd afford diapers. She talked more than she had to anyone in months. When she finished, she felt exposed. Embarrassed she'd said so much to a stranger. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." James stayed quiet for a second, like he was searching for the right answer, or maybe the honest one. "What Victoria did was unacceptable," he said finally. "I don't allow that kind of treatment in my stores, and when I saw you standing there in front of that window—" He paused. "I don't know how to explain it. Something in me just said I had to help, that's all." It wasn't the whole truth, but in that moment even he didn't fully understand what he'd felt. The next morning, just past 8, someone knocked on the door of the small rented room Claire called home. She opened it, still in her robe, startled to see him standing there. "Mr. Callahan, what are you doing here?" "James," he corrected. "I came to ask you something. Are you looking for work?" Claire crossed her arms, defensive. "Yes, but nobody wants to hire a woman 8 months pregnant. I've tried half the city." "I do." She looked at him, wary. "I don't need pity." "It's not pity," he said without hesitation. "I need staff at the store, and I think you'd be good at it. That's all this is." Silence. Claire wanted to believe him, but she also knew what it meant to depend on someone else's generosity and how fast that could turn into something else. "Get ready," James said, like he'd already decided for both of them. "I'll wait outside." When they got to the store, Victoria greeted them with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Victoria," James said, straight to the point, "Claire's going to be working with us. I want you to teach her everything you know." Victoria's smile cracked for half a second. "Excuse me?" "Everything you know," he repeated. "Starting today." Claire tried to step in. "Sir, really, you don't have to—" But James had already turned toward his office. "Just do what I'm asking, Victoria," he said without looking back. And just like that, no further explanation, Claire Bennett became the newest employee at Ivory Lane. Neither of them had any idea that this job, brand new as it was about to become the biggest test of their lives. Because what was coming, weeks later, wouldn't just put Claire's hard-earned position on the line, it would test the trust of a man who, without quite realizing it, was starting to fall for her. The first few days were rough. Victoria taught with clear reluctance, short instructions, barely any patience. But Claire, tired as she was, picked things up fast and treated every customer with a warmth, James noticed it right away, that couldn't be taught. "You're a natural," he told her one afternoon. "I've never seen anyone build that kind of trust with customers so fast." Claire smiled, not sure what to say. She wasn't used to compliments, not lately anyway. But while she was thriving, something was curdling in Victoria. She'd been at that store 6 years. 6 years close to James, learning every habit, every gesture, telling herself year after year that sooner or later he'd see her as more than just his manager. She loved him, had loved him quietly since her first day, and over time that love had mixed with something colder, more calculated, the certainty that if things kept going the way they were, she'd eventually become Mrs. Callahan, co-owner in every way that mattered of everything he'd built. It wasn't just love, it was ambition. And Victoria had never had a problem confusing the two. That's why the moment Claire had walked in that afternoon, pregnant and in worn-out clothes, Victoria hadn't felt an ounce of sympathy. She'd felt contempt. The easy kind of contempt that comes from needing every single day to remind yourself you're above people like that. But now, week after week, she watched that same woman effortlessly win over everything Victoria had spent years calculating and clawing for. And Victoria understood, with a clarity that turned her blood cold, that Claire wasn't just an inconvenient hire anymore. She was a threat, the biggest one she'd faced in 6 years, and she wasn't about to lose her plan to some stranger with nothing to offer, except apparently everything Victoria didn't have. It started small, offhand comments to co-workers about how convenient Claire's hiring had been. Then a little cash going missing from the register. Never much, just enough to plant doubt. Victoria knew exactly what she was doing, and she felt absolutely no guilt about it. Every time she saw James laughing with Claire over lunch, every time their conversations ran long, the certainty that she had to act grew stronger. Over the following weeks, something shifted between James and Claire. It started with lunch. At first, it was simple courtesy. He didn't like the idea of her eating alone in the back while he ordered takeout, but those lunches kept getting longer. 15 minutes turned into 30, 30 into an hour some days. They talked about everything and nothing. Baby names she was considering, books he never had time to read, the city, the weather, stray memories from childhood. Claire noticed, without saying it, that she looked forward to those lunches more than anything else in her day. And James, who'd spent years buried in spreadsheets and meetings and the weight of running a business he'd built from nothing, felt, for the first time in a long time, actually excited to walk into work. One afternoon, sorting boxes in the stockroom, he asked almost without thinking, "Can I?" he said, nodding at her belly. Claire, surprised, nodded back. He rested his hand there carefully, like he was touching something he was afraid to break. And right then, the baby kicked. James's eyes went wide, a smile spreading across his face that Claire hadn't seen before. No guard up, none of the boss, the owner, the man who gave orders in a steady voice, just a man, amazed. "He moved," he said, almost a whisper. "Yeah," she said, laughing softly. "He does that every time I eat something sweet." They stood there a moment, his hand still on her belly, until they both realized how close they were standing and stepped back, a little embarrassed, not saying anything more about it. But something between them had already changed. A few days later, a customer in a foul mood, noticing Claire's belly, wrinkled her nose in disgust. "You're working? Pregnant like that? This place has no standards." Claire kept her cool, the way she'd learned to these past few months. "I'd be happy to help you regardless," she said, steady. James, passing by, caught the comment. He didn't say anything, let Claire finish handling it herself, and only after the woman left did he walk over. "You didn't have to just take that." "I didn't," she said, smiling a little. "I just chose not to give her a fight." "You're tougher than you think," he said quietly. "I have to be," she said, hand on her belly. "It's not just me anymore." Victoria saw all of it, saw James's hand on Claire's belly through the stockroom door, saw the smile he hadn't given her in years, if he ever had. That night after closing, she worked up a courage she'd been holding on to for a long time. "James," she said, once they were alone. "Got a minute?" "Sure, what's up?" She stepped closer, too close. "We've worked together for years," she said, voice low. "And I think there's always been something between us, something we've never said out loud." She tried to kiss him. James stepped back, caught off guard, and gently but firmly stopped her, a hand between them. "Victoria, no." She froze, embarrassment climbing up her face. "I care about you," he continued, "as a friend, as a great manager. We've worked together for years and I respect you for that. but I've never felt anything more. It's because of her, isn't it? Victoria said, voice shaking between anger and hurt. That woman you barely even know. This has nothing to do with you, he said, calm but firm, and I need you not to try that again. Victoria didn't answer, grabbed her bag and walked out without another word, but something inside her had cracked, and things that break like that, quietly, usually end up looking for a way to hurt someone. A few days later, over another lunch, the conversation drifted to the past. Did you always have money? Claire asked, genuinely curious about a man who was starting to matter to her. James smiled, almost wistful. Not even close. My mom cleaned houses, sometimes 2 or 3 a day. I'd tag along when there was nobody to watch me, do my homework on somebody's back steps while she worked. I wouldn't have guessed. It was rough, he admitted. Some months we didn't know if we'd make rent, but my mom never quit. Worked herself to the bone so I could stay in school. When I graduated, I started this business with a small loan and a lot of fear. And her, your mom? She passed 6 years ago, he said, voice lower, but she got to see the first store open. That much, at least, life gave me. Claire stayed quiet a moment, letting the weight of that sit. Where'd you grow up? She asked after a bit. South Side. Small houses, cracked sidewalks back then. Why? I grew up there too, she said, frowning, like something was clicking into place. On Maple Street. James looked at her. I lived there too. I was about 7 before we moved. They stared at each other for a long moment. Did you have curly hair and permanently skinned knees? Claire asked, a disbelieving smile starting to form. Were you the kid who taught me to ride a bike without training wheels, on the corner house with the big oak tree? They both went quiet, like time had just folded in on itself. No way, Claire whispered. We were neighbors, James said, wonder in his voice. Less than a year, if I remember right. Then my mom and I moved. Claire smiled, eyes bright. We used to play every afternoon, and one time, she laughed, covering her mouth. You picked a flower out of Mrs. Alvarez's garden and gave it to me, and she nearly chased you down the block for it. James burst out laughing. I remember that, and you told me you were going to marry me when we grew up. I was 7, don't judge me. They both laughed, but under it there was something deeper, something neither of them said out loud yet. The feeling that the two of them meeting in that store, that afternoon by the window, hadn't been pure chance. That maybe, in some way, neither of them fully understood. Something in James had recognized Claire before his mind ever caught up. Around that time, James mentioned, almost in passing, that he was thinking about letting Victoria go. Her sales numbers were down, her attitude with customers had gotten sharper, and a few employees had complained. Claire, surprising herself, spoke up for her. Don't do that yet, she said. I know she hasn't been kind to me, but I know what it's like to lose a job, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone, and not even her. Give her another chance. James looked at her, surprised. After everything she's done, you're defending her. I'm not defending her, Claire said. I'm just asking you to hold off before deciding. I know how fast you can end up with nothing. I wouldn't wish that on the person who likes me least. James thought about it for a long moment. Fine, he said finally. I won't do anything for now, but if something else happens, I won't be able to look past it. Claire nodded, not knowing that decision, made out of compassion, would cost her dearly just a few weeks later. One afternoon, unpacking a new shipment in the stockroom, James brought something up almost casually. When I was a kid, I wanted this one action figure, Captain Cosmo. Remember those? Cost a fortune back then. My mum could never afford it. I got why, but I still wanted it so bad. Did you ever buy it later, as an adult, I mean? You could own 100 of them by now. James laughed, shrugging it off. I don't know. Guess time just went by and I stopped thinking about it. You forget stuff like that. Claire didn't say anything else in the moment, but she didn't forget. That weekend, she got her first paycheck. Not much, but it was hers, earned on her own, and it brought a kind of pride she hadn't felt in months. She set aside what she needed, and with what little was left, she decided to do something that made no financial sense at all, but felt, deep down, like something she had to do. She went looking for the toy. She hit 3 different collectible shops. Most told her it hadn't been made in years, that it was basically impossible to find. Until, in a small shop tucked away downtown, she found it. A little worn with age, but complete. Captain Cosmo, red cape and all. Claire felt her eyes fill with tears right there in the store. She bought it on the spot. She decided she'd give it to him that week, at the dinner James had invited her to at his place. A casual dinner, he'd said, just as friends. to thank her for everything she'd done since she started. She tucked the toy into her bag, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, wanting it to be a surprise. What she didn't know was that Victoria had overheard the invitation from the hallway that same afternoon, and she was already thinking about how to ruin it. The night of the dinner, Claire got to the store early, nervous, checking every so often that her bag was still zipped, that the wrapping hadn't gotten crushed. They were closing up soon when Victoria walked up to the register, brow furrowed. "There's money missing," she announced, loud enough for the other employees to hear. Again, James came out of his office at the commotion. "What's going on?" "Money's missing from the register," Victoria repeated, her calm too calm, hiding something darker underneath. "And it's not the first time since she started." She looked at Claire. "I haven't touched the register all day," Claire said, her heart racing. "I don't even go near it, you know that, I only work the floor." "Then you shouldn't mind if we check your bag," Victoria said, smiling coldly. "Hold on," James cut in, before Claire could respond. "Nobody's going through anyone's bag without a reason. Victoria, do you actually have proof it was her, or are you just assuming because she's new? I've worked here 6 years, and money's never gone missing until she showed up," Victoria said, deliberately calm. "Draw your own conclusions." "That's not proof, that's a coincidence," James said, frowning. "Claire doesn't even work the register. You're the one who put her on the floor." For a second, Claire felt like she could breathe again. He was defending her, he believed her. But Victoria wasn't done yet. "Then let her prove it," she said, staring straight at Claire. "If she's got nothing to hide, it shouldn't be a problem to just open the bag and clear this up. Or should we just keep wondering every time something's missing?" Claire felt her blood run cold, not because she was scared they'd find stolen money, she hadn't touched a cent that wasn't hers, but because that toy was in there. The surprise. And she didn't want James to see it like this, in the middle of an accusation, before she could give it to him the way she'd meant to. "No," she said, clutching the bag to her chest. "I'm not opening it here." "See?" Victoria said, looking at James. "You see how she's acting?" James looked at Claire, and for the first time since he'd met her, something like doubt crossed his face. "Claire," he said, his voice lower than usual. "If you've got nothing to hide, why won't you open the bag?" She looked at him, feeling the ground drop out from under her, caught between a truth she couldn't say yet, and the suspicion building in the eyes of the man she'd started to love. "Trust me," she said, barely above a whisper. "Please, just this once. Trust me without asking." But James's silence said more than any words could have, and in that silence, Victoria saw her opening. Before anyone could stop her, Victoria stepped forward and yanked the bag out of Claire's hands. "No!" Claire shouted, grabbing for it, but it was too late. Victoria tore it open, and there, half hidden in the tissue paper, were a few folded bills, the change from the toy shop, right next to the edge of the action figure, barely visible. But Victoria, quick and calculated, pulled out only the cash, holding it up high, blocking the rest from view. "There it is," she said, feigning shock, but dripping with triumph underneath. "See, I told you." "That's my money," Claire cried, eyes filling with tears. "It's what was left from my paycheck. I don't know where you're getting. Money's been going missing since the day you started." Victoria cut her off, turning to James, playing a part she'd clearly rehearsed. "I suspected it from the beginning. I just didn't want to accuse you without proof." James lowered his head. Claire searched his eyes for anything at all, that told her he didn't believe Victoria, that he trusted her, that he knew her well enough to know this was impossible, but he wouldn't look at her. "I'm calling the police," Victoria announced, pulling out her phone with suspicious speed. "No," James said finally, his voice flat. "Don't call the police." For a second, Claire felt a desperate flicker of relief. "But don't let her just walk out of here," he added, not looking at her. "I need to figure out what's going on." "James, please," Claire said, stepping toward him. "You have to believe me, I would never take $1 that wasn't mine. Not now, Claire," he cut in a voice she'd never heard from him before. Tired, hurt, confused. "I need to think." Claire felt the floor give out beneath her. She grabbed her bag and what was left of it, the toy still hidden inside, and walked out of the store almost running, not saying another word, tears falling before she could stop them. James stood there, staring at nothing. He had no idea in that moment that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Claire cried the entire way home. She cried over the humiliation, over the injustice, but mostly she cried because for 1 second, just one, but enough, she'd seen doubt in James's eyes. And that hurt worse than any accusation. The days that followed were a quiet kind of torment. She called him once, twice, 3 times, texted, trying to explain, or trying to at least, without giving away the secret of the toy, hoping he'd at least call her back. Nothing. On his end, James wasn't finding any peace either. He spent his nights tossing and turning, replaying every look on Claire's face, every word. Something didn't add up. She didn't fit the profile of someone capable of stealing, let alone that clumsily, that obviously, but the evidence had been right there in front of him, or so he thought. One afternoon, walking toward the back office, he heard Victoria's voice, low, laughing on the phone with someone. He stopped before walking in, not wanting to interrupt. "I'm telling you, it was perfect," he heard her say, a tone in her voice he'd never heard before. Light, almost amused. "I slipped the cash in her bag when she wasn't looking, caught her when she left it in the fitting room for a second. Worked exactly like I planned." James barely even hesitated. Well, he hesitated a little, but enough to fire her. A pause, a laugh. I know, but it was worth it. She's finally gone. Now I just need James to realize I'm the one who should have been there all along." James felt the air catch in his chest. He pushed the door open. Victoria spun around, color draining from her face as she saw him standing there, an expression on his face she'd never seen before. "James, that's not what—" "Hang up the phone," he said, his voice low and cold. She did, hands shaking. "I heard everything," James said. "Every word. I can explain. Get your things," he cut her off, "and get out of this store. Now. I don't want to see you here again." "James, please," she said, voice breaking, stepping toward him, reaching for his hand. "You don't understand. I did it because I love you. I've always loved you. And that woman doesn't deserve you. You need someone on your level, someone who—" He stepped back, pulling his hand away. "I never loved you," he said, with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "And I never will. Get out, Victoria, before I call the police for what you just admitted to." She stood frozen for a second, shame and hurt washing over her face. Then, without another word, she grabbed her bag and walked out, crying, realizing for the first time everything she'd lost over a love that was never returned. James didn't waste a second. He grabbed his phone and called Claire. Once. Twice. No answer. He left the store almost running, got in his car, and drove straight to her place, his heart pounding harder than he could remember it ever pounding before. He knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. "Claire!" he called out, knocking harder. "Claire, it's me. I need to talk to you." Silence. A neighbor, drawn out by the noise, stepped into the hallway, worry on her face. "Sir, do you know her?" "Yes." "Do you know where she is?" "She got real sick a couple hours ago. Started having pains. Passed out for a second. We called an ambulance and they took her to Willow Creek Maternity Hospital." James's heart stopped for a second. "Thank you," he managed, before running back to his car. He drove like he'd never driven in his life, his mind flooded with images he didn't want to imagine, repeating one thought over and over: don't let it be too late. He got to the hospital and practically burst into the maternity ward, asking every nurse he passed until one finally led him to the room where Claire lay, pale, exhausted, but conscious. "Claire." She opened her eyes at the sound of his voice. "James," she whispered, surprise and hurt crossing her face. "What are you doing here?" He moved to her bedside, taking her hand carefully. "I'm sorry," he said, voice breaking. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you, that I doubted you even for a second. Victoria told me everything. She planted the money in your bag. It was her from the start." Claire closed her eyes, tears slipping down the sides of her face, but before she could answer, a sharp pain ripped through her. "James." "Something's wrong." A nurse rushed in immediately, checking the monitors, and within seconds the calm of the room turned into urgent motion. Labor had started early, and there were complications. "We need to get her into the OR now," the doctor said, striding in. "I'm coming with her," James said, not letting go of Claire's hand. "Are you the husband?" a nurse asked, hurried. "I'm with her," James answered, holding on tighter. "I'm not leaving her." Nobody had time to question it further. They let him go as far as protocol allowed, and he stayed there, pacing outside the operating room for what felt like hours, though the clock on the wall showed barely 40 minutes. When they finally let him in, Claire was awake, exhausted, her eyes searching urgently for someone. "My son," she said the moment she saw him. "Is he okay?" "He's in the NICU, just as a precaution," James said, moving closer, taking her hand again. "The doctor said it was just a scare. He's going to be fine, Claire, he's fine." She closed her eyes, tears mixing with relief and exhaustion. "I'm sorry." James said again, kneeling by the bed, not letting go of her hand. "I'm sorry I doubted you, even for a second. I should have trusted you. You asked me to, and I didn't." "You were scared," she said quietly. "You're not the first person to doubt something that looked that clear-cut. But it hurt, James. It really hurt. I know. And I'm going to spend as long as it takes proving to you it won't happen again." Claire looked at him, something in her softening, even though the last few days still ached somewhere underneath. "There was a moment, back at the store," she said, quiet, almost to herself, "when I thought I'd lost you, not the job, you. I thought you were going to believe the worst about me forever, and that I'd have to raise my son knowing the one person who made me feel like I mattered never fully trusted me. That's not going to happen," James said, squeezing her hand. "I made a mistake that day. I let fear and old habits about how things look outweigh everything I already knew about you, who you are, how you talked about your son before he was even born. There's no excuse. So all I can promise is that next time something looks off, I'll ask you first, before anyone else." Claire nodded, letting the tears fall freely now. "I'm going to hold you to that," she said, with a tired smile. A few minutes later, a doctor walked in, carefully carrying a small bundle wrapped in a pale blue blanket. "Here he is," she said, smiling. "A healthy baby boy. Just needed a little extra time to settle in." She handed the baby to Claire, who took him with shaking hands, staring at him like he was the only thing in the world. James stepped closer, and looking at the baby's tiny face, felt something in his chest break and rebuild itself at the same time. The doctor looked at him, smiling gently. "And you are—" James didn't hesitate. "I'm his father," he said, with a certainty that left no room for debate. It wasn't true by blood, but in that moment, looking at that baby, it felt like the most honest thing he'd said in a long time. The doctor smiled and stepped out, leaving them alone. Claire looked at James, the baby asleep in her arms. "Grab my bag, would you?" she said, nodding toward the chair where it had been set down. "There's something in there I've been meaning to give you for days now. Something I hunted down in 3 different shops last week, after you told me about the toy your mom could never afford." James, confused, picked up the bag and handed it to her. Carefully, she pulled out the small package wrapped in tissue paper, a little worn now from the days it had spent hidden away, and held it out to him. "This is what was actually in my bag that day," she said. "Not the money Victoria planted. That's why I didn't want to open it in front of everyone. I wanted to give it to you that night, at dinner, as a surprise, as a thank you for everything you did for me and my son." James unwrapped it with shaking hands, and there it was. Captain Cosmo, red cape, silver helmet, a little worn with age, but complete. He stared at it, speechless, for a long moment. "How?" he finally said, voice breaking. "How did you even find this? They stopped making these years ago. I looked for one myself once a long time back and found nothing." "I hit a bunch of shops," Claire said, smiling faintly. "Almost gave up. But I kept thinking about what you told me, about your mom never being able to buy it for you, and I felt like I had to find it, like I owed it to that 7-year-old who used to play with me on Maple Street." James held the toy against his chest, and for the first time in a long time he didn't try to hold back the tears. "Nobody," he said, voice barely there, "nobody's ever done anything like this for me. It never even occurred to me to look for it myself. And you, with nothing to your name, spent your first paycheck finding it for me. I wanted you to know how grateful I am," she said, "for believing in me when no one else did, for giving me a chance, for everything." James leaned in, and with a gentleness that stood in contrast to the weight of the moment, rested his forehead against hers. "Claire," he said, "I don't want this to end here. I want to be with you and him, not as the boss who helped you out one afternoon. As something a lot bigger than that." She smiled, eyes full of tears, exhaustion, and a happiness she hadn't felt in a long time. "I want that too," she whispered. James took her hand, looked into her eyes, and with the toy still pressed to his chest with his other hand, said, almost without thinking, with a certainty he'd been carrying for weeks, "Marry me, whenever you're ready, whenever this all settles down, whenever you want. But I need you to know that's what I want. To build a family with you, with him." Claire laughed through her tears. "Are you seriously proposing to me right now? In a hospital room, fresh out of surgery?" "Couldn't think of a better time," he said, smiling. "Honestly, I don't want to wait for the perfect moment. This one's already pretty perfect in its own way." She looked at him, at the baby asleep in her arms, at the man who'd changed her life since that afternoon in front of the window. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, I want that." A year later, Ivory Lane was still the most loved boutique in the neighborhood, though a few things had changed. There was a new manager now, a warm, easygoing young woman named Grace, hired after Victoria left town without saying goodbye to anyone. Some of the staff heard she'd moved out of state, looking for a fresh start, far from the memory of everything she'd lost. Claire wasn't just an employee anymore. Over time, with James's support, she'd learned every part of the business, eventually becoming the manager overseeing every location, a position she'd earned through her own work, not favors. That afternoon, while helping a customer with the same warmth as always, walking her through a new collection of fabrics, the bell over the door rang. James walked in, a nearly one-year-old boy on his hip, grinning, cheeks flushed from picking him up at daycare. He paused in the doorway a moment, just watching her, watching the way she leaned in patiently with the customer, laughed softly at something she said, filled the whole store with a warmth he remembered clearly from that very first afternoon. When she finished with the customer, Claire turned and saw them there, her son in his arms, looking at her with the same expression that, after all this time, still made her blush a little. She walked over, took the baby into her arms, kissed his forehead, then looked at James. He leaned in and kissed her, soft and brief, but full of everything they'd built together. Then, one hand resting gently on her stomach, now gently rounded. "How's she doing today?" he asked, quiet, with the same smile he'd had that afternoon in the stockroom, the first time he'd felt a baby move that back then wasn't even his. "Calm," Claire said, smiling. "Like her dad once he finally stops worrying about everything." James laughed, pulling her and their son into a hug, right there in the middle of the store where it had all begun. Outside, the afternoon sun poured through the window, lighting up the same tiny clothes that, a year earlier, Claire had looked at without any hope, never knowing that on the other side of that glass was something she never could have imagined: a family, a home, and a love that had been waiting quietly, since two kids used to play together on a street called Maple, long before life brought them back to each other. Sometimes, at night, Claire thought back to that afternoon by the window, how close she'd come to turning around and never walking into that store at all, how different everything would have been if pride or fear had stopped her at the door. They didn't. And that's why every time she opened the store in the morning, every time she saw a young mother pause in front of that same window, with that same mix of hope and shame she'd once felt herself, she walked over, not out of pity, out of the certainty that comes from knowing better than most that sometimes all it takes is one person choosing to see another with dignity, and an entire life can change course. And that's the story. For now, anyway. If you made it this far, let me know in the comments. On a scale from 0 to 10, what would you rate this story?